In the heart of the American Midwest, on a gentle evening in 1925, a child named Malcolm Little opened his eyes to the world. The house on the outskirts of Omaha, Nebraska was a modest wooden structure painted white, with a porch that faced the setting sun. Inside, the rooms were filled with the soft scent of bread and the warmth of a family gathering at dusk. Oil lamps cast a golden halo on the walls, and the quiet rustle of curtains in the breeze made patterns of light and shadow. This was a home where voices were low and steady, where a mother named Louise read aloud from books of history and faith, her words floating through the hallway like a lullaby. Louise Little was a woman of quiet strength, born on the island of Grenada, her skin the color of cinnamon and her hair dark as the night sky. She sewed by the window in the afternoon light, her needle threading fabric in a rhythm as steady as the seasons. The children played on a braided rug at her feet, their laughter a soft counterpoint to the distant hum of prairie insects. Malcolm, one of 7 siblings, was a thoughtful child with curious eyes, his face often turned upward to watch the clouds drifting across the endless blue. His father Earl was a tall man with a deep voice, a Baptist preacher who carried the spirit of Marcus Garvey in his heart, and who spoke of a future where Black people would stand proud and free. The backyard of the Omaha home was a wild tangle of sunflowers and tall grasses, where the children chased fireflies as the twilight deepened. A wooden fence, weathered by wind and rain, enclosed a small garden where Louise grew vegetables and herbs. In summer, the smell of marigolds and tomato leaves filled the air, and the sound of crickets created a steady, soothing chorus. Malcolm would sometimes sit alone on the back step, tracing pictures in the dirt with a stick, his mind wandering over the vast landscapes of his imagination. The sky above Nebraska was wide and open, a canvas of shifting colors at sunset: orange, pink, lavender, that reflected in his young eyes. When Malcolm was still young, the family moved to Lansing, Michigan, seeking a quieter life away from the city. They settled into a white farmhouse with a sloping roof and a barn painted red, surrounded by fields that rolled gently toward a distant wood. The air here was crisp and smelled of hay and wild mint. In the mornings, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, lighting up the table where the family gathered for oatmeal and honey. Earl would bow his head and say grace, his voice a low rumble that filled the small room with a sense of safety and belonging. The farm in Mason, just outside Lansing, became the center of Malcolm's childhood. He learned to chop firewood, his small hands gripping the axe handle as he imitated his father's careful movements. The sound of the axe meeting wood was a rhythmic thud that echoed across the yard, blending with the clucking of hens and the lowing of cattle. In the afternoons, he would walk along the edge of the property, following a narrow path through tall grasses that whispered secrets in the wind. A small pond reflected the sky like a mirror, its surface broken only by the occasional splash of a frog. It was a place of solitude, where the noise of the world faded into the rustle of leaves. Louise continued her children's education at home, teaching them to read and write in the quiet of the living room. Books were precious objects, handled with care, their pages smelling of age and paper. Malcolm would trace the words with his finger, sounding them out softly as his mother nodded encouragement. The evening hours were reserved for stories, tales of ancestors who built kingdoms, of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, of a heritage that stretched back to the sands of Africa. The coal fire glowed orange in the hearth, its warmth a cocoon against the chill of a Michigan autumn. In the wintertime, the farm transformed under a blanket of snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the moonlight. The children would bundle up in coats patched by their mother and venture out to sled down the gentle hill behind the barn. Their breath puffed white in the cold air, and their laughter rose to the stars that dotted the ink-black sky. Inside the farmhouse, the family huddled by the stove, roasting chestnuts and listening to Earl's sermons as he practiced them in the flickering candlelight. These moments were woven from the fabric of love and determination, a quiet foundation that would later sustain Malcolm through all the turns of his turbulent life. But even this peaceful existence was touched by shadows. Earl Little's message of self-reliance stirred unease in some hearts, and the family faced threats that arrived like a cold draft under the door. Still, the children were shielded as much as possible, their parents wrapping them in the ordinary rhythms of the day, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, mending clothes. Little Malcolm watched the world with a growing awareness, his mind storing images of the golden fields and the steady courage of his parents. The prairie lights of Nebraska and the farmland shadows of Michigan would stay with him forever, like a gentle hand on his shoulder guiding him forward through the dark. By the time Malcolm reached his teenage years, the winds of change had blown through his life, scattering his family like autumn leaves. He arrived in Boston in 1941 carrying a small suitcase and a heart full of dreams, ready to find his place in the world. His half-sister Ella welcomed him into her home in the Roxbury neighborhood, a lively area where brownstone buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, their facades glowing in the amber light of street lamps. The front steps, often called stoops, were gathering places for neighbors who chatted softly as the evening settled in. The streets hummed with the low murmur of city life, distant trolley bells, the clip-clop of horse-drawn carts, and the gentle roar of a city that never quite fell asleep. Ella's home was a place of order and warmth, with lace curtains that diffused the sunlight and a kitchen that always smelled of fresh biscuits and collard greens. Malcolm helped with chores, polishing the wood-paneled walls until they gleamed and sweeping the front walk beneath the elm trees. In the quiet mornings, he would sit by the parlor window and watch the world come alive, delivery men carrying crates, children walking to school with books pressed to their chests, and old men tipping their hats as they passed. It was here that he began to study the art of observation, noticing the small details of dress and gesture that told stories all their own. To earn a living, Malcolm took a job as a shoeshine at a bustling train station. The floors of the station were made of polished marble that reflected the golden light of chandeliers, and the air smelled of leather, coffee, and the faint trace of steam. Passengers came and went in waves, their footsteps echoing in the grand hall. Malcolm knelt beside his wooden shoeshine box, its compartments filled with brushes and tins of polish, and he worked with quiet precision. Each brushstroke was a meditation, the repetitive motion transforming dull leather into a mirror shine. The clinking of coins in his pocket was a small comfort, but the real reward was the silent gratitude of the travelers who looked down and smiled. By night, the city transformed into a tapestry of soft lights and quiet rhythms. Malcolm would walk the streets of Roxbury, his footsteps steady on the pavement, past barbershops and corner stores now shuttered for the evening. The glow of a juke joint spilled onto the sidewalk from a half-open door, and the sound of a saxophone drifted out like a slow, smoky sigh. Yet he often preferred the quieter corners, the alleys where cats darted behind trash cans and the moonlight painted silver patterns on the brick walls. The city, for all its noise, had a gentle side that cradled the lonely and the dreamers alike. Malcolm's curiosity soon led him to a job as a railroad porter, working the overnight trains that slid through the countryside like quiet serpents. The Pullman cars were long and elegant, with plush seats upholstered in deep burgundy and brass fittings that caught the amber light of wall sconces. As the train swayed gently along the tracks, Malcolm walked the narrow aisle, his uniform crisp and his demeanor calm, offering passengers pillows and blankets. Through the windows, the dark landscape unfolded, small towns with twinkling lights, rivers shimmering under the moon, and endless fields that passed in a silent, soothing rhythm. The whistle of the train was a low, melancholy note that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 stories. During the long journeys between stops, Malcolm would sit in the porter's compartment at the back of the car, a tiny room with a fold-down seat and a small window. He would read newspapers left behind by passengers, scanning the headlines and the photographs, piecing together a wider world that felt both distant and deeply compelling. The rhythm of the wheels on the rails became a gentle hypnotic beat, click-clack, that lulled him into a state of reflective calm. In those quiet hours, with the cold glass against his forehead, he began to dream of bigger things, of a voice that might one day be heard above the rumble of trains. The cities along the route unfolded like a series of paintings: Washington, D.C. with its marble monuments shining white under the moon, New York with its towering silhouette of spires, and Chicago with the Great Lakes stretching out like a sheet of silver. In each place, Malcolm glimpsed the lives of Black communities who moved with resilience and grace, their laughter spilling from open windows, their church choirs filling the Sunday air with hope. He stored these images away, like precious photographs, in the album of his mind. But the bright city lights also held temptations that distracted a young man searching for identity. Malcolm began to drift toward the faster pace of Harlem nights, where the jazz was louder and the shadows deeper. Still, even in that vibrant chaos, there were moments of extraordinary quiet: a rooftop at dawn after a long night, watching the sun rise over the tenements and paint the brickwork in shades of rose and gold. It was a city of contrasts, and it taught him that peace could be found in the most unlikely places. The railroad had shown him the vastness of America, but the cities taught him about the human heart, and both lessons would prove invaluable in the years to come. The path turned unexpectedly in 1946, when a series of poor choices led Malcolm to a prison cell in Charlestown, Massachusetts. The building was formidable, a fortress of gray stone with tall barred windows that let in strips of pale light. Inside, the corridors echoed with the distant clink of keys and the soft shuffle of feet. The cell itself was a small rectangle of space, just large enough for a metal cot, a sink, and a tiny shelf. The walls were painted a faded cream, stained by time and the touch of many hands. At first, the space felt oppressive, a cage that closed in on the spirit, but soon it would become a place of unexpected transformation. In the early days, Malcolm was restless and angry, pacing the floor until the stones seemed to wear down under his feet. But the silence of the cell began to work on him, like water smoothing a jagged rock. One afternoon, as a thin stream of sunlight crept across the floor, he picked up a dictionary from the prison library trolley. The book was thick and heavy, its cover worn soft by use. He opened it to the first page and began to copy the words by hand, the way a monk might illuminate a manuscript. The act was painstaking and slow, each letter traced with care onto a notepad, and yet it became a profound meditation. The days turned into weeks, and Malcolm filled page after page with the elegant curves of the alphabet, then with the definitions of words he had never known existed. The cell became a hermitage of learning, lit by the weak glow of a single bulb that cast long shadows on the wall. At night, when the main lights went out, he would read by the thin shaft of light that came from the corridor, pressing his face close to the book. The words became companions: serene, eloquent, constellations, each one a key that unlocked a new room in his mind. The world outside the bars expanded inward, limitless and profound. The prison library was a tall, echoing room lined with wooden shelves that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Malcolm would walk there each morning, his footsteps measured, his gaze fixed on the spines that stood in neat rows. He read philosophy, history, theology, and poetry, the volumes gathering in a stack beside his chair as the afternoon light moved across the worn floorboards. The librarian, a quiet man with spectacles and a gentle manner, would sometimes offer a nod of encouragement, recognizing the hunger in the young inmate's eyes. The room was a sanctuary of stillness, where the turning of pages was the only sound. In the isolation of his cell, Malcolm began to write letters, first to his family, and then to figures of influence. The pen moved across the paper in a flowing script that grew more confident with each evening. He would describe the ideas he had encountered, the questions that stirred in his chest, and the gradual awakening of a new sense of purpose. The desk was a simple board that folded down from the wall, lit by the small lamp that cast a warm circle of light. Everything outside that circle faded into darkness, leaving only the words and the quiet hum of his own thoughts. It was during these years that he was introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam by his siblings, who wrote to him of a faith that restored dignity and self-respect. The letters were filled with gentle persuasion, and Malcolm received them like a man in a desert finding a stream. He studied the lessons carefully, underlining passages with a worn pencil, his brow furrowed in concentration. The cell, once a place of punishment, now felt like a classroom where the soul learned to breathe again. The stillness that had once oppressed him became a fertile soil in which a new identity could take root. When the first light of dawn slipped through the barred window, Malcolm would rise and face east toward Mecca, performing the quiet ritual of morning prayer. Though he was still learning, the movements brought a sense of grounding that nothing else could. The water for ablution was cold, drawn from a small sink, but it refreshed his spirit. In that silent communion, the walls of the prison seemed to dissolve, leaving only the vastness of the sky and the connection to something far greater than himself. After 6.5 years, the gates opened and Malcolm walked out into the bright world a free man in 1952, the name Malcolm X already forming on his lips. The sunlight was warm on his face, and the sound of birdsong was a melody he had almost forgotten. He carried with him a suitcase full of books and a mind sharpened by discipline. The prison had been a crucible of quiet transformation, and the light that once barely pierced the bars had become a steady inner radiance that would guide him for the rest of his days. The years that followed brought Malcolm to the heart of a movement, and his voice became a steady presence in the lives of many. The Nation of Islam provided a structure of quiet discipline that appealed to his transformed soul. He rose early each morning, before the city stirred, and walked to the mosque through streets that were still and soft with shadow. The building was unassuming from the outside, plain brick with tall, narrow windows, but inside, it opened into a space of profound tranquility. The prayer hall was vast and clean, draped in carpets of deep blue and gold that muffled every step into a whisper. Light entered the mosque through arched windows high above, the glass tinted in shades of amber and jade, filtering the morning sun into a gentle radiance that seemed almost liquid. The air smelled of sandalwood and incense, a faint trail that curled toward the high ceiling. In these early hours, the hall was nearly empty, save for a few elders who sat with their beads, their lips moving in silent prayer. Malcolm would find a spot near a pillar, where a pool of sunlight formed a warm island on the carpet, and he would lower himself to his knees, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. The prayer itself was a series of movements, standing, bowing, prostrating, each one a conversation with the divine that required no words. The forehead pressed to the ground, the soft brush of wool against skin, the rhythm of breath slowing to match the deep stillness of the room. In this act, Malcolm found a simplicity that untangled the complex knots of the world. The mosque was a fortress of calm, a place where the anger and noise outside could not enter. The quiet was not empty, but filled with a presence that cradled every worry and set it gently aside. After prayer, Malcolm would retreat to a small office at the back of the building, a room lined with bookshelves and a heavy oak desk. Here he prepared his speeches, not with fiery gestures, but with the quiet determination of a scholar. The desk lamp cast a golden circle on the paper, and the inkwell at his right hand gleamed. He would write slowly, choosing each word with care, pausing often to stare out the window at the sky changing from pink to blue. The scratching of his pen was the only sound, a soft and steady rhythm like the heartbeat of the building. The books on his shelves came from 1,000 different worlds: theology, history, philosophy, and the writings of thinkers from every corner of the globe. Their spines were worn from repeated use, pages marked with slips of paper and marginal notes in pencil. When the writing grew difficult, he would lean back in his chair and read a passage, letting the words of another mind guide his own. The room was a haven of intellect, where ideas could be examined like precious stones held up to the light. On days when the mosque was empty, Malcolm would walk through the prayer hall, his footfall silent on the thick carpets. He would straighten the prayer rugs, align the books on the shelf by the entrance, and open a window to let in the breeze. The city hummed faintly outside, but inside, all was serene. The minaret of the mosque, a slender tower with a crescent on top, caught the last light of afternoon, its reflection stretching across the courtyard like a gentle finger pointing toward the heavens. Sparrows bathed in the dust of the courtyard, their small bodies trembling with life. The community gathered each week to hear his words, but it was in the quiet preparation that his message was truly born. He spoke of pride, of self-love, of a history that had been stolen and must be reclaimed. Yet his tone, even in the most challenging moments, carried an undercurrent of love, a fierce, protective love that emanated from his deep stillness. The congregation listened in the dusky light of the mosque, the amber windows glowing behind him, and many felt that they were not just hearing a speech, but witnessing a prayer. As the evening call to prayer echoed through the neighborhood, the mosque became a place of soft shadows and quiet reverence once more. The last light of day painted the interior in shades of lavender and gold, and the air cooled as the desert-like heat of the day receded. Malcolm would sometimes remain, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, simply breathing in the silence. The world outside was filled with struggle, but here, for a brief moment, there was only peace, a peace that he would carry with him like a lantern through the dark streets on his way home. In the spring of 1964, Malcolm boarded an airplane bound for the other side of the world. The journey itself was a quiet odyssey over oceans and continents, the plane humming steadily through clouds that looked like drifts of cotton wool below. Through the oval window, he watched the Atlantic give way to the golden coastline of Europe, then the sparkling Mediterranean, and finally the vast expanse of the Arabian desert. The sun rose high over the sand, the dunes rippling like waves of silk in shades of amber and rose. Time seemed to slow as the plane descended toward Jeddah, the gateway to the holy city of Mecca. The airport was a modest affair, with open-air corridors and the scent of incense drifting on the dry wind. Malcolm donned the simple white garments of the pilgrim, two unstitched pieces of cloth that erased all distinction of wealth or status. He stood among thousands of others, all dressed the same, their faces reflecting every shade of humanity. The bus that carried them to Mecca moved through a landscape of harsh beauty, rocky hills that softened under the golden light of late afternoon, small settlements of whitewashed stone, and palm trees that cast slender shadows on the sand. Arriving in Mecca at night was like entering a dream. The city glowed with the soft light of lanterns, and the marble courtyards surrounding the great mosque shimmered under the moon. Thousands of pilgrims filled the vast plaza, their movements fluid and peaceful, like a great river winding slowly around the sacred Kaaba. The black cube, draped in silk and embroidered with gold, stood at the center of the world, and the voices of the faithful rose in a gentle murmur of prayer. Malcolm walked among them, his heart beating in the rhythm of the ancient words, feeling the weight of a lifetime dissolve in the soft Arabian night. The experience of the pilgrimage was not one of dramatic revelation but of quiet, persistent awakening. Each day, before dawn, he rose to perform the circumambulation of the Kaaba, moving counterclockwise with the crowd, his shoulder brushing against strangers who were his brothers. The air was cool and fragrant, the marble smooth beneath his bare feet. As the sun broke over the mountains, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. It was in these moments, surrounded by a sea of humanity yet utterly alone with the divine, that Malcolm felt a profound shift, a recognition that true faith knew no color, and that the human family was a tapestry woven from countless threads. He wrote letters back to his family and colleagues in America, describing the transformation with a pen that felt lighter than ever before. Sitting in a quiet corner of the mosque, with the dust of the desert on his white robe and the light filtering through the perforated marble screens, he poured his thoughts onto paper. The words spoke of unity, of the genuine brotherhood he had witnessed when people of all races shared the same meal, the same prayer rug, the same earnest hope. The pen strokes were slow and deliberate, each sentence a step toward a new understanding. The days in Mecca unfolded like the pages of an illuminated manuscript. Malcolm visited the hills of Mina and the plains of Arafat, where the pilgrims gathered in tents under the vast canopy of the sky. The landscape was stark but full of quiet majesty, camel caravans resting in the distance, the wind sifting through the dunes, the occasional cry of a vendor selling dates and cool water. He sat with a group of fellow pilgrims one evening, eating from a common plate of rice and lamb, the laughter and soft conversation a balm to his soul. The tent glowed from within, the lantern casting a warm light on their faces, and the stars outside were a thick, brilliant carpet. Water was a precious gift, and the ritual of washing before prayer became a mindful act of purification. Malcolm would walk to the stone basins, the cool water running over his hands and face in rivulets, washing away not just the dust, but the weight of old certainties. The sound of water was a constant gentle music in the courtyards, mingling with the distant call to prayer that echoed from the minarets 5 times a day. Each call was a thread of sound weaving through the air, drawing everyone into a shared moment of stillness. When the pilgrimage ended, Malcolm stood on a hillside overlooking the city, the white buildings of Mecca nestled in a valley of golden stone. The sun was setting once again, and the sky was alive with color, a deepening tapestry of rose and violet. He felt an immense calm, a sense of rebirth that no words could fully capture. The journey had stripped away layers of anger and revealed a core of light. As the first stars appeared, he turned to walk back to his quarters, his footsteps quiet on the warm stone, carrying within him the holy silence of the desert that would remain for the rest of his life. The final year of Malcolm's life was spent in a modest house in the Elmhurst neighborhood of Queens, New York. It was a simple 2-story brick home with a porch and a small patch of green lawn where his daughters played in the afternoons. The elm trees on the street had grown tall and old, their branches forming a canopy that dappled the sunlight onto the pavement. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the sounds of sparrows and the distant jingle of an ice cream truck on summer days. It was here, away from the clamor of the city, that Malcolm found a space to write, to think, and to be a father. His study was a small room at the back of the house, lined with books from floor to ceiling. The shelves were made of dark wood, and they held volumes in Arabic, French, and English, their pages filled with the wisdom of centuries. A large window faced the backyard garden, where his wife Betty had planted roses and lavender that climbed a wooden trellis. The desk was an old oak roll-top, covered in papers, letters, and a manual typewriter that gleamed under the cone of light from a green-shaded lamp. The chair was worn and comfortable, the leather cracked but soft, and it held the shape of a man who had spent many hours in contemplation. Each morning, Malcolm would rise before the children and make his way to the kitchen, where the coffee percolator bubbled cheerfully on the stove. The smell of fresh bread often filled the air, reminder of Betty's early baking. He would take his cup to the study and sit by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the dew on the grass. The birds in the garden, cardinals and robins, would flit from branch to branch, and the peace of the morning would settle into his bones. This was a time for private reflection, for reading the Quran or jotting notes in the margins of a manuscript, all before the world's demands crept in. The Organization of Afro-American Unity, which he had founded after his return from Mecca, was an effort to build bridges and foster understanding. Much of the work took place in quiet conversations around his dining table, where scholars and activists would gather to share ideas over cups of tea. The talk was earnest but gentle, voices rising and falling in measured tones, the clinking of spoons a counterpoint to the discussion. The afternoon light would stream through the lace curtains, painting stripes of gold on the tablecloth, and the scent of mint from the garden would drift through the open window. When the house grew still in the early afternoon, Malcolm would return to the study to work on his autobiography. The manuscript had been a long labor, a collaboration with the writer Alex Haley, and the two had spent many hours at that desk, piecing together the narrative. But now, in solitude, Malcolm reviewed the chapters, his pen making small corrections in the margins. He would read his own story back to himself, the words a river of memory that carried him from the Nebraska plains to the mosque courtyards of Mecca. The typewriter keys would clack softly as he drafted responses to letters, and the gentle rhythm of work filled the room. The garden was his refuge when the mind needed rest. A modest stretch of grass with a stone path and a wooden bench, shaded by a flowering dogwood that burst into white blossoms each spring. Malcolm would walk barefoot on the cool grass, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze on the horizon where the city's towers rose faintly in the distance. The air was fresh with the scent of cut grass and earth, and the sound of his daughter's laughter from the front yard would bring a smile to his face. It was a simple joy, the kind he had rarely known in his younger years, and he savored it like sweet water. In the evenings, the family gathered in the living room, where the lighting was warm and the furniture soft with age. Betty would read to the girls from a picture book, their small bodies curled against her, while Malcolm listened from his armchair, a quiet contentment settling over him. The room was adorned with a few keepsakes, a painting of a mosque, a photograph of his parents, a tapestry from Africa that hung above the sofa. The world outside could be harsh, but within these walls, there was only the profound peace of ordinary familial love. As the last days of February 1965 approached, Malcolm continued to work, write, and pray, unaware that his journey would soon reach its end. He spent the evening of February 20th at home, preparing a speech and tucking his daughters into bed. The house was quiet, the street lamps outside casting a gentle glow through the curtains. He sat for a while in his study, the window slightly open to the cool night air, and looked out at the stars that hung low and bright over Queens. The peace of that moment, the books, the lamp, the soft breathing of his children down the hall, was the true legacy of a man who had traveled far and found stillness at last. And it is that image of a quiet study in Elmhurst with the moon rising over the garden that remains a lasting portrait of Malcolm X, not as an icon of fire, but as a seeker of light.